Imagine lying there, somewhere between waking and dreaming, when a question slips into your mind like a whisper in the dark. What if we weren't the first? What if another civilization, long before ours, had risen, thrived, and vanished, leaving only whispers in the stone and shadows under the sea? You've been told the story of humanity as a neat timeline: fire, farming, cities, pyramids, space travel. But the past has never been tidy, has it? It's more like a patchwork quilt with holes burned through, pieces missing, and others stitched in where they don't belong. Somewhere in those gaps, maybe something extraordinary happened. Maybe someone extraordinary lived. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there, so I can imagine the moment with you. Because tonight, we'll dig. Not with shovels, but with curiosity. We'll brush away the dust of certainty and run our fingers along the strange footprints in the forgotten sand. You might think of the oldest ruins you've ever heard of, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Stonehenge, and feel sure that's as far back as it goes. But that's only the part of the story written in clear ink. What about the chapters blurred by time, drowned by oceans, buried under miles of soil? What about the evidence we didn't even know how to see? In the windswept deserts of Namibia, there are rock engravings so old they seem to predate everything else in the region. Figures of animals and humans etched with a style that feels almost alien. Historians have debated whether they're truly as ancient as they appear, or if the dating has been thrown off by erosion and mineral deposits. And here's the thing. Erosion can erase details just as easily as it can preserve them. The same rock that holds a story can also hide it. Every so often, a farmer or construction crew stumbles on something that simply shouldn't exist where it does. A carved stone, a metal object deep in the wrong layer of earth, a fragment of something that speaks in a voice we can't quite understand. Most are explained away. A few linger, filed under unsolved, in dusty academic papers. And those few are enough to make you wonder whether our view of history is like an old photograph, sharp in places, blurred in others, and with entire corners torn away. Think about footprints, not the kind you leave in soft beach sand, but fossilized ones, turned to stone. They survive because conditions were perfect: mud, then sediment, then time. Most of the millions of steps taken by animals and people in the past left no trace at all. And history is like that. For every scrap we find, countless others vanish without ceremony. Which means it's possible, just possible, that a civilization could disappear so completely we'd only find the faintest marks, if any at all. And we're not even talking about millions of years here. Take the city of Tanis in ancient Egypt. Once a thriving capital, it was swallowed by the shifting Nile and then the sands. It took centuries before anyone remembered where it had been, and even now much of it lies hidden. If that can happen in just a few thousand years, what might vanish in 10 times that, or 100? There's a place in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, that shattered our neat timelines when it was uncovered. Massive carved stones, assembled into circles standing there for over 11,000 years. For decades we told ourselves organised monument-building societies began with farming, around 5,000 years ago. But here was a structure older than the invention of the wheel, older than writing, older than the pyramids. Its builders had no metal tools that we know of, no domesticated beasts of burden, yet they raised megaliths weighing tons. How? And why bury it on purpose when they were done? Archaeologists are still debating whether it was a temple, a gathering place, or something stranger. Oddly enough, there's a fact about camels that always comes to mind when I think about the fragility of timelines. People often assume camels are native to the Middle East, but the fossil record shows they actually evolved in North America millions of years ago, only later spreading to Asia and Africa. Which means whole species can originate in one place, disappear from it entirely, and only much later be rediscovered somewhere else. Civilizations could do the same. If you strip away our modern conveniences, our steel, our electricity, our satellites, how long would it take before our cities were nothing more than shadows in the soil? Roads crack and crumble within decades without maintenance. Wooden structures decay in years. Steel rusts, concrete erodes, glass shatters. Even plastic, the supposed eternal material, becomes brittle and breaks down eventually. Given enough centuries, almost everything we've made could vanish or transform into something unrecognizable. Some scientists have calculated that after just a few thousand years without humans, nature would reclaim almost every trace of us. Skyscrapers would collapse, forests would cover suburbs, rivers would shift their courses. In geological time, that's nothing more than the blink of an eye, and in that blink, a culture's entire existence could be erased, leaving future archaeologists scratching their heads over a few scattered artifacts and odd chemical traces in the soil. So maybe we aren't the first. Maybe there were others, whose stories were swallowed by time before ours even began. And maybe the footprints they left are still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to notice them. You've probably walked right past one before, thinking it was just a rock, or a curious bump in the ground, or a pattern in the sand. That's the thing about history. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, quietly, for the right eyes to come along. We'll keep walking forward, step by step, brushing away the dust where we can, and wondering about the marks we can't see. And as the night deepens, we'll follow those marks into places where the official story doesn't quite fit, because that's where the interesting possibilities live. It's strange how stories survive when buildings do not. The walls crumble, the tools rust, but a tale can drift through millennia, reshaped by each tongue it passes. You've probably heard the flood stories, the biblical Noah, Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek myth, the deluge in Hindu texts, where Manu survives by building a great boat and is guided by a giant fish. Even the Ojibwe of North America tell of a time when the earth was flooded and the animals dove to retrieve mud to recreate land. Could it be that these stories, spread across continents and oceans, are the memory of something real? Not just the localized floods that happen anywhere rivers and seas meet, but a disaster vast enough to be remembered by cultures that never spoke to each other. Historians still debate whether these myths point to one cataclysmic event or are simply parallel inventions, born of the universal human fear of water's power. But what if they are fragments of a single memory, one carried so far back in time it precedes the civilizations we usually call the first? The end of the last ice age, about 11,700 years ago, brought rapid sea level rise. The melting glaciers poured water into the oceans, drowning coastlines worldwide. Some geologists estimate sea levels rose by over 100 meters in a relatively short span of time. Imagine the cities and settlements of that era, whatever their level of sophistication, slowly watching the sea claim them. The coastlines we see today are not the ones ancient people knew. If a culture thrived on those now submerged shores, their ruins might be far beyond the easy reach of archaeology. It's easy to forget how much land is hidden under the waves. The continental shelves, the relatively shallow areas extending out from our shores, cover vast areas, and during the Ice Age much of them was dry land. The North Sea was once a place called Doggerland, home to humans and rich with wildlife. Today its remains lie under cold grey waters between Britain and mainland Europe. The fishermen who drag up stone tools and mammoth bones from its floor are, in a way, hauling up pieces of another world. And it isn't just Europe. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found stone structures that appear deliberately placed, with straight walls and right angles. Some suggest they are the remains of a city mentioned in Hindu scripture, while others believe they're natural formations. Off Japan's Yonaguni Island, massive underwater terraces and steps stir similar debate. Natural erosion can mimic human construction, so no one can agree definitively whether these are the handiwork of ancient builders or simply the artistry of the sea itself. The odd fact that comes to mind here is that coral reefs, those bright living cities of the ocean, are actually built on the bones of their dead. Layer after layer, generation after generation, their skeletons pile up, creating the vast limestone structures we see today. What we perceive as vibrant and new is often built atop a deep ancient graveyard. Civilizations could be like that too, rising on the remnants of those that came before without fully realizing it. In archaeology, there's a term for myths and oral histories that match unexpected evidence: geomythology. It's when a story preserves the memory of a geological event, like a volcanic eruption or earthquake, far beyond the lifespan of anyone who experienced it. The eruption of Mount Mazama, which formed Oregon's Crater Lake about 7,700 years ago, is remembered in the oral traditions of the Klamath people with uncanny detail. Details that match modern geological understanding. If one eruption can echo for thousands of years, could the story of a drowned world echo for tens of thousands? But myths are not archives in the way a modern historian would like. They shift, they merge, they exaggerate, they acquire symbols and morals. In the process, the literal truth might fade, yet the emotional truth survives. People remember not the exact date or the precise topography, but the feeling, fear, loss, awe. Which means if there was a civilization before ours, and if it perished in a flood, the survivors' descendants might have remembered the terror of it long after they forgot the names, the language, or the architecture. This is where the argument often turns practical. Skeptics say, if there was an advanced civilization before ours, where are the artifacts? And it's a fair question. But think of what is lost even in recent history. The Library of Alexandria, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, vanished in a series of fires and conflicts. No one agrees exactly what was lost, but we know the loss was immense. That was just 2,000 years ago. Multiply that by 5 or 10 or 50, and the gaps widen until you could fit an entire forgotten era through them. And while we're on the subject of records, here's a peculiar truth. The oldest surviving piece of literature we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written on clay tablets around 2100 BCE. Clay survives well. Papyrus and parchment do not. Imagine if a lost civilization's record-keeping relied on wood, cloth, or other organic materials. Those would be gone long before we came looking. We might be left with only the durable things, stone carvings, metal tools, or perhaps nothing at all if nature reclaimed them fully. Consider the human brain's own tendency toward pattern making. When we find something unusual in the ground, a shaped stone, a wall where no wall should be, our minds race to connect it to a story. Sometimes that story is real, sometimes it's wishful thinking. But wishful thinking has built entire branches of pseudo-history and conspiracy. The challenge is walking the thin line between skepticism and openness, between dismissing the impossible and embracing the improbable. Historians are still debating whether the flood myths represent a shared prehistoric event or many unrelated local ones. But when you line them up, side by side, across the world's cultures, there's a rhythm to them that feels more than coincidence. Water rises, people flee to high ground, a chosen few survive, often with animals, to repopulate the earth. Then the waters recede and the world begins again. That's not proof, but it's a whisper, one worth leaning closer to hear. And as you close your eyes and drift with that thought, imagine the coastlines of the world as they were 15,000 years ago. Wider, richer, dotted with settlements we have never seen. Imagine them as nightfalls, fires flickering along the shore, music and voices rising over the sound of the surf. Imagine the ocean as a patient hunter, creeping higher with each year, each century, until one by one the fires go out and the waves erase the last footprints in the sand. If you've ever floated in the shallows and looked down through the shifting patterns of sunlight on sand, you know how easily shapes can trick the eye. A line of rocks looks like a road, a shadow becomes a staircase, but sometimes the sea isn't playing tricks. Sometimes the shapes are real and they don't belong there. The first time divers saw the structures off Yonaguni, Japan in the 1980s, they were struck by the clean angles and flat platforms, the sharp corners and long steps descending into the blue. It looked, they said, like a drowned city. At one point, a massive terrace leads to what resembles an altar. Some even claim to see carvings, eyes, mouths, symbols, worn smooth by centuries underwater. Marine geologists argue that the site could be the result of natural processes. The sandstone there tends to fracture along horizontal and vertical lines, creating geometric forms that, to a human eye hungry for meaning, look like the work of a careful hand. Others insist the regularity is too precise, that these are the remnants of a civilization swallowed by the sea during the rapid post-Ice Age flooding. Archaeologists are still debating whether Yonaguni is a quirk of geology or a clue to a chapter of history we've lost. Far away, in the Gulf of Kambat off India's west coast, sonar surveys in 2001 detected what looked like the outlines of rectangular structures on the seabed. Divers brought up artifacts, stone tools, pottery shards that some claimed were over 9,000 years old. Skeptics countered that the finds might have been washed there from shore, or that the dating was flawed. But the idea of an ancient city lying in the silt, older than any known urban centre, is hard to resist. There's something oddly human about these underwater mysteries. We want to believe we've found Atlantis, not because Plato's tale demands a factual origin, but because we crave the notion that great things existed before us. It's a comfort, in a way, to think we're not alone in the story of human ambition and fragility. And yet, there's also a warning in it. If they could be wiped from the surface so completely, what hope do we have of permanence? One of the strangest facts about the ocean is that it is, in many places, less explored than the surfaces of the Moon or Mars. More than 80% of the seafloor remains unmapped at high resolution. Think about that. Vast stretches of our own planet are still unknown to us, including those shallow shelves where ancient people might have lived before the seas rose. Every year, storms and shifting sands reveal shipwrecks and artifacts no one expected. What else could be hiding there? Something not from centuries ago, but from ages so distant we'd struggle to imagine them. Consider Heracleion, the Egyptian city that vanished under the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. Ancient texts mentioned it, but its location was forgotten until 2000, when archaeologists began bringing up colossal statues, coins, and the remains of temples. The city had been a bustling port, visited by Greek merchants, before an earthquake and liquefaction, when saturated soil behaves like a liquid, dragged it under the waves. If something that prominent could disappear within recorded history, what might have been lost before anyone wrote anything down? The thing about these underwater finds is how easily they fall into the cracks of interpretation. Natural rock formations can look like walls and streets. Ruins can be mistaken for geology. The sea preserves some materials, stone, ceramics, while destroying others. Wood, textiles, even metals can vanish, leaving only their absence. You can swim past the ghost of a harbour wall and never know it's there unless you're looking for it. And here's a curious aside. Starfish, those slow, harmless-looking creatures, can actually see with tiny eye spots at the tips of their arms. They use this vision to navigate reefs and hunt prey. It's a reminder that perception is often far broader than we give it credit for, and that maybe we should look more closely before deciding what is or isn't there. Historians and marine archaeologists are still debating whether submerged structures like those at Yonaguni and Dwarka represent proof of advanced prehistoric societies, or are the remnants of small coastal communities amplified by our imaginations. Either way, they force us to think about time differently. We tend to imagine history as a straight road stretching back from the present, but perhaps it's more like a tide, advancing, retreating, leaving behind traces in layers we can barely see. If you close your eyes now, picture those steps at Yonaguni leading down into darkness. Imagine what it would be like to stand there before the waters came, hearing gulls overhead, the wind carrying scents from a market in the distance. Imagine the sea creeping closer, year after year, until one day it is at your doorstep. You move inland, but the water follows, and soon all that remains of your home is a shadow on the seabed. This is why some scientists think the real record of ancient civilizations might lie beneath the oceans, buried under silt and coral, not in deserts or mountaintops where we've searched for centuries, but under the waves, in places our ancestors called home when the world was colder and the seas lower. To find them, we'd need patience, technology, and maybe a little luck, because the ocean guards its secrets well. The problem is, even if we do find something, proving it belonged to a civilization before us is another matter entirely. Dating stone is notoriously tricky. Context is everything, and underwater contexts are fragile. Currents move artifacts, marine life burrows into structures. The line between natural and man-made becomes blurry, and in that blur, possibilities live. So the next time you stand on a beach and stare out at the horizon, think about what might lie just beyond sight, resting quietly in the blue. Maybe it's a shipwreck, maybe it's an ancient harbour, or maybe, just maybe, it's the last surviving wall of a city from a time when the world was young in ways we can barely comprehend. Stone has a way of outlasting everything. Wood rots, metal rusts, clay shatters, but stone remains, silent, weathered, unyielding. It can outlive empires, religions, even entire species, and sometimes it stands in ways that force us to wonder who placed it there, and why. In southeastern Turkey, on a low hill called Göbekli Tepe, the earth once hid circles of massive stone pillars carved with intricate images of animals, foxes, snakes, boars, birds. Some of the stones are over 5 meters tall and weigh up to 10 tons. Radiocarbon dating suggests they were erected more than 11,000 years ago, at a time when humans were thought to be little more than scattered hunter-gatherer bands. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE for reasons no one can agree on. Its discovery in the 1990s shattered the neat progression we'd imagined. First agriculture, then settlements, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe flips that order, implying that large gatherings, perhaps for ritual or communal purposes, may have sparked the need for farming, not the other way around. Historians are still debating whether this was truly the first temple or something stranger, a seasonal gathering place, a communal storytelling hub, or a monument to forgotten beliefs. Further west in Lebanon lies the ancient site of Baalbek. The Romans built a grand temple complex there, but beneath their work lies a foundation of stone so large they defy easy explanation. The stone of the pregnant woman weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. Nearby, two others are even larger, each more than 1,200 tons. Modern cranes would struggle to move them. No ancient text explains exactly how these stones were quarried, transported, or positioned with such precision. And then there's Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where vast limestone blocks are fitted together so tightly that a knife blade can't slip between them. The stones are irregular in shape, yet somehow interlock perfectly without mortar. The Inca inherited the site but may not have built its oldest walls. Local legends speak of an earlier people, now vanished, who possessed the knowledge to shape stone with an ease that seems almost impossible. If you've ever tried to move a heavy piece of furniture alone, you know the absurdity of thinking about shifting something that weighs hundreds of tons. And yet, ancient builders did this without steel cranes, without diesel engines, without anything resembling our modern machinery. We often assume they used ramps, ropes, rollers, methods that are physically possible but require staggering amounts of labour and coordination. But when the stones are beyond a certain size, the logistics start to sound almost mythical. Here's an odd fact to sit alongside all this. The heaviest weight ever lifted by a human being, recorded under controlled conditions, was just over half a ton by a weightlifter in 1957, a fraction of one Baalbek stone. So whenever you hear someone say, well, they just hauled them with manpower, it's worth remembering the sheer scale of the task. One theory suggests that moving such stones wasn't about efficiency at all, but about symbolism, making the monument itself a display of impossible effort, a statement of unity, power, or devotion. Others speculate that the knowledge to move and shape such stones may have been inherited from an earlier culture, one already skilled in monumental building but long gone by the time history began to be written. Historians are still debating whether sites like Baalbek, Sacsayhuaman, and the unfinished stone quarries scattered across the globe represent continuous human ingenuity or echoes of something older. The challenge is that stone itself doesn't carry a timestamp. Without organic material like wood or bone nearby, it's almost impossible to date when a block was shaped or moved. This leaves plenty of space for both reasonable hypotheses and more speculative ideas to grow. The megaliths also share another oddity. Many are aligned with astronomical events. At Stonehenge, the sun rises perfectly over the heel stone at the summer solstice. At Nabta Playa in Egypt, standing stones form a circle aligned with the rising of certain stars thousands of years ago. Göbekli Tepe's pillars may have been oriented towards specific celestial points as well. Alignments like these hint at a deep, sustained interest in the sky, suggesting that ancient people may have tracked celestial cycles far earlier than we imagined. This raises a quiet but unsettling possibility. If an earlier civilization had mastered certain forms of engineering and astronomy, and then collapsed, the survivors might have preserved fragments of that knowledge, enough to inspire the builders of later monuments, even if the original context was lost. In this way, the stones become like hand-me-downs across generations, reused, reinterpreted, sometimes misremembered. Sometimes, the craftsmanship itself feels almost like a signature, an echo left by hands we'll never know. In Egypt's granite quarries at Aswan, you can see an unfinished obelisk still lying in the bedrock. It's enormous, over 1,000 tons, and abandoned because cracks appeared during carving. The tool marks are still there, preserved as if the workers had just walked away yesterday. Standing there, you can almost imagine a similar scene playing out tens of thousands of years earlier in a place now buried or submerged. And then there's an even more poetic thought. What if these stones are not just remnants of human achievement, but also the only survivors of a deeper past. Everything else, stories, tools, homes, has vanished, and only the stone too heavy to move remains. They might be the last fingerprints of a civilization that existed before ours, a civilization that didn't leave writing we could read or artifacts we could recognize. If you were to walk through Baalbek at dusk, the light spilling across those massive blocks, you'd feel something that isn't just awe. It's a kind of vertigo, a sense that the scale of these things doesn't quite fit with the story we've told ourselves. And maybe that's the real reason we keep coming back to them, measuring them, photographing them, arguing over them. Because deep down we know they might belong to someone else's chapter of the human story, someone we've forgotten. If stone is the stubborn keeper of the past, the earth itself is its restless editor. Our planet is always rewriting, erasing and layering over its own pages. You might think of geology as slow and patient, but in the right conditions it can be swift and merciless. The way a single landslide can bury a town or an earthquake can turn the ground into liquid and swallow buildings whole. If there ever was a civilization before ours, the geological clock would have been its most relentless enemy. The first trick of the Earth's erasure is erosion. Wind and water are tireless, grinding mountains into dust grain by grain. In a few centuries they can wear carvings into smooth faces, make inscriptions unreadable, and turn roads into barely noticeable depressions in the soil. Over millennia the transformation is total. A once grand avenue becomes part of a hill, a fortress wall becomes a ridge no different from the ones beside it. The second is sedimentation. In river deltas, floodplains and low-lying coasts, each season deposits a thin layer of silt or sand. Over thousands of years these layers build up, burying whatever lies beneath them. Entire ancient cities like those along the Indus River were covered this way. Now imagine 10 or 20,000 years of such burial. Without deliberate excavation, the past disappears not because it was destroyed, but because it is hidden under the sheer weight of time. And then there is glaciation. During an ice age, glaciers act like colossal bulldozers, grinding the land beneath them, scraping away soil and rock, leaving behind bare bedrock. Anything in their path, villages, forests, roads, is obliterated. If an advanced culture thrived in a region later covered by ice, its remains could be erased so thoroughly we'd never even suspect it was there. One curious fact about ice: it records the atmosphere. Tiny bubbles trapped in ancient ice cores can tell us the composition of air from hundreds of thousands of years ago. But ice doesn't preserve buildings, it doesn't keep art intact, it shatters and pulverizes as it moves, and when it melts, the floodwaters wash the debris far from its original place, scattering the puzzle pieces until no one knows they belong to the same picture. Tectonic activity plays a quieter but equally destructive role. The surface of the Earth is made of moving plates, drifting a few centimeters each year. Over millions of years, whole continents shift, mountains rise, oceans open and close. Cities built on a coastline could end up thousands of meters below the sea, or thrust upward into highlands where no one would think to look for them. This process is so slow that it's invisible in a human lifetime, yet so complete that after enough time, even the memory of a coastline can vanish. Historians are still debating whether certain puzzling geological formations, odd alignments of stones, terraces or walls, are human-made or natural. Part of the difficulty is that geological forces can reshape human work into something almost unrecognizable. Imagine a stone pyramid subjected to earthquakes, floods and landslides for 20,000 years. Would it still look like a pyramid, or just a strange hill? Volcanic activity is another ruthless editor. Entire civilizations have been erased by a single eruption. Pompeii and Herculaneum are the most famous examples, their streets frozen in ash since 79 CE. But those cities are lucky in a sense. They were preserved. In most cases, lava and pyroclastic flows consume everything in their path, leaving behind only rock. If a volcano erupted over a city tens of thousands of years ago, the city would now be part of the mountain itself, indistinguishable from its slopes. Oddly enough, trees can tell us about ancient catastrophes. In the growth rings of certain long-lived trees, scientists have found evidence of volcanic winters, years when ash clouds blocked sunlight, slowing growth across entire regions. These records suggest sudden, climate shifts that could have wiped out settlements, perhaps whole cultures, without leaving obvious ruins. Then there's the sea. Coastal erosion is a slow thief. but relentless. The cliffs of eastern England retreat by about a metre each year. Entire villages have fallen into the water over the centuries. The process is faster in storms, but even without drama, the result is the same. Land vanishes, and with it, whatever stood there. Given enough time, the outlines of ancient coastlines blur into something untraceable. You might be wondering, if the Earth is so good at erasing, how do we know anything about the deep past at all? The answer is, we're lucky. We find what survives by accident. Fossils, for example, are rare precisely because conditions must be perfect for preservation: rapid burial, mineral replacement, protection from erosion. The same applies to artifacts. The vast majority of human creations vanish forever. Only a fraction survive, and only a fraction of those are ever found. Here's an odd, almost off-topic fact. The oldest known shoe is about 5,500 years old, found in an Armenian cave, perfectly preserved by dry, cool conditions. It was made of leather, laced up the front. That's a trivial object compared to a monument, but it survived purely by accident. Without the right environment, it would have rotted away in a year. Scale that up, and you start to see why finding traces of a hypothetical pre-human civilization would be so difficult. The geological clock doesn't care about us. It ticks in millions of years, not decades. In its time, cities are momentary decorations on the skin of the earth, easily brushed away. And when that happens, there's no malice in it, just the slow, constant turning of a planet that's been here far longer than we have. So if there were others before us, their world might be gone in every visible sense. What remains could be buried kilometers deep, scattered on the ocean floor or fused into rock. The clues might be so subtle, an unusual layer of minerals, a strange isotopic signature, that they look like geological quirks rather than cultural fingerprints. If you picture it, you might imagine walking across a grassy field, unaware that 10 meters below your feet lies the shattered heart of a city. Stone streets, worn by feet that walked long before our kind. Tools shaped by hands no one remembers. And above it all, the sun still rises and sets, the seasons turn, and the earth keeps quietly rewriting its own story. Every so often, a story surfaces, quietly at first, then picked up by newspapers, then argued over in academic journals and on late-night radio shows, about something found where it shouldn't be. A hammerhead embedded in rock supposedly millions of years old, a delicate metallic sphere discovered deep in a coal seam, a carved figurine recovered from a layer of earth that predates any known human culture. These are the kinds of finds that, if genuine, seem to whisper that the timeline we've been taught might be incomplete. Take the so-called London hammer, found in Texas in 1936. It's a simple tool, an iron hammerhead with a wooden handle, encased in a concretion of stone-like material. Some claim the surrounding rock is over 100 million years old, which would make the hammer impossibly ancient. Skeptics argue that the concretion formed around a modern hammer dropped into a crevice, a natural cementing process that can happen much faster than you might think. The hammer's true origin remains uncertain, and historians are still debating whether it's a genuine out-of-place artifact, or just a curious coincidence of geology and human activity. Then there are the Klerksdorp spheres, small metallic-looking objects found in 3-billion-year-old pyrophyllite deposits in South Africa. They're not artifacts in the traditional sense, at least that's the consensus, but they are perfectly round or disc-shaped, with delicate grooves around their circumference. Geologists generally attribute them to natural crystallization and sedimentary processes. Still, their symmetry and polish make them feel oddly intentional, as if they were shaped by a hand rather than by time. And in the coal mines of Wilburton, Oklahoma, miners in the early 20th century reportedly found an iron pot encased in coal. According to the accounts, the coal dated to the Carboniferous period, over 300 million years ago. Mainstream science points out that without strict chain of custody and controlled excavation, such claims are impossible to verify. Objects can be dropped, buried, and reburied in ways that confuse the record. But the story persists in the margins of history, where unanswered questions tend to gather. Here's a strange but true fact. The oldest known musical instrument is a flute made from vulture bone, found in a German cave and dated to around 40,000 years ago. That's a blink of an eye compared to the deep geological timescales of the anomalies we've just mentioned. Yet even something as delicate as a flute can survive under the right conditions, which raises the question, If there were older civilizations, what might they have made that could endure millions of years? Stone tools could survive. Certain metals, if buried and sealed from corrosion, might survive. But most of the things we build today, plastics, composites, electronics, would break down far more quickly than we like to imagine. One of the more controversial examples is the Antikythera mechanism, a complex arrangement of bronze gears recovered from a Greek shipwreck around 100 BCE. It's not an out-of-place artifact in terms of dating. It belongs firmly to the ancient world, but it's often brought up in these discussions because of its sophistication. For a long time, no other device like it was known to exist until 1,000 years later. It reminds us that sometimes technology appears, is used for a while, and is then lost, only to be reinvented later. If that can happen within recorded history, what might have happened in prehistory? Historians are still debating whether some of these finds truly point to forgotten technology, or are simply misinterpretations of natural formations and coincidences. But the emotional pull of these objects is undeniable. A round stone with grooves, a metal shard from a deep rock layer. They give us the same sensation as seeing a light far away in the fog. You can't be sure if it's a lantern or just a trick of your eyes, but it makes you want to walk toward it. There's also the uncomfortable possibility that we've found evidence already, and simply failed to recognize it for what it is. Imagine an archaeologist 100,000 years from now finding a chunk of corroded circuitry. Without the context of our civilization, they might see it as nothing more than a mineral deposit. Context is everything, and the deeper in time we go, the less context we have. Oddly enough, one of the most durable traces we might leave behind isn't our buildings or our machines, but our pollutants. Certain synthetic chemicals, like long-lived plastics and industrial compounds, may persist in the geological record for millions of years. If an earlier civilization had industry, its pollutants might still be detectable in ancient sediments, even if its cities were gone. That's the kind of clue scientists today are starting to look for, chemical fingerprints rather than obvious ruins. And if we found such a fingerprint, the academic debate would be fierce. Was it natural? Was it a rare geologic process? Or was it, in some faint and distant way, a sign of minds like ours, or unlike ours, that once shaped the world? So much of this comes down to interpretation. A hammer in stone can be a modern tool encased by accident, or the last survivor of a vanished culture. A sphere in ancient rock can be a geological oddity, or a relic of something long forgotten. The truth depends on the evidence we can gather, and the imagination we dare to apply to it. If you ever find yourself walking along a riverbank or through a quarry, look closely at the stones. See if one of them seems too regular, too deliberate, as if it's been touched by something intelligent. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. That uncertainty, that whisper of possibility, is what keeps the search alive. High in the Bolivian Andes, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, lies a place where the stones look as if they were cut yesterday. Pumapunku, part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological complex, is scattered with massive blocks of andesite and red sandstone, some weighing over 100 tons. But it's not just their size that's striking, it's their precision. Edges are razor sharp, corners are perfectly square, and intricate cutouts are so uniform they could almost have been machined. The site is a puzzle. The Tiwanaku culture, which flourished in this region between 500 and 1000 CE, is credited with its construction. Yet Pumapunku stands apart even from their other impressive stonework. Blocks fit together without mortar, with joints so tight you couldn't slide a razor blade between them. Some are shaped like puzzle pieces, interlocking in ways that suggest both strength and design foresight. If you've ever handled Lego bricks, you've felt a miniature version of this, except here the bricks weigh as much as small locomotives. How these stones were quarried, transported and cut remains a matter of debate. The nearest known quarry for the red sandstone is about 10 kilometers away, for the andesite over 90 kilometers. Moving such masses across rugged terrain without wheels, because there's no evidence the Tiwanaku used them, would have been a monumental task. Historians are still debating whether it was done with large labour forces, sledges and ropes, or if there's something about their techniques we haven't yet rediscovered. Some researchers propose that copper tools, hardened and repeatedly resharpened, could have shaped the stones. But andesite is extremely hard, registering about 7 on the Mohs scale, harder than steel, and copper tools would wear quickly. Others point to the possibility of stone hammers and abrasion with sand. It's feasible, But when you look closely at the perfectly straight grooves and uniform drilled holes at Pumapunku, you can't help but wonder if there's more to the story. Here's an odd but true aside. Certain desert beetles in Namibia can collect water from fog by standing at the right angle, letting condensation run down their backs to their mouths. It's a reminder that nature can develop ingenious solutions without the tools we think are necessary. Ancient engineers, too, might have had methods we no longer imagine, techniques that seem impossible simply because we've forgotten them. Across the world, other sites echo this mystery. At Ollantaytambo in Peru, massive terraces and precisely cut stones seem to defy the crude tools attributed to their builders. At Giza, the granite blocks in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid show a level of precision cutting that still baffles some stonemasons today. Even in ancient Greece, the fitting of ashlar masonry at Mycenae suggests a knowledge of weight distribution and seismic resistance that feels advanced. If we think of history as a chain of skill and knowledge, it's tempting to imagine these feats as products of a long lineage, one in which techniques were inherited, improved, and sometimes lost. But what if the chain extends farther back than we think? What if some of the engineering principles at Pumapunku, Baalbek, or elsewhere were passed down from an earlier forgotten source, adapted to local conditions but rooted in something older? It's not a new thought. Even in ancient times, people attributed older ruins to mythical forerunners, the Cyclopes in Greek lore, or the Tuatha De Danann in Irish myth. Sometimes these stories were just a way to explain ruins whose origin had been forgotten, but they also hint at a long-standing human habit. When confronted with something beyond our understanding, we assume it came from someone, or something, before us. The engineering at Pumapunku also raises the question of motivation. If you were building for practical purposes, shelter, defense, you wouldn't need this level of precision. The stones could be rougher, the joints less exact. Precision like this suggests either an aesthetic or symbolic goal, or perhaps a technological one we no longer understand. Could the interlocking shapes have been designed to resist earthquakes, to hold metal fittings? Or was there some other function entirely now lost to us? Historians are still debating whether the Tiwanaku inherited Pumapunku from an earlier culture, or built it themselves at the height of their power. The lack of written records makes the question harder to answer. What we do know is that the site was eventually abandoned, its stones scattered, perhaps by an earthquake, perhaps by later people's scavenging materials. Imagine standing there now, as the sun sinks behind the Andes, the cold wind cutting through your jacket. The stones lie half buried in earth, some tilted, some broken, yet the precision is still there, visible in every clean edge. You run your fingers along a groove, feeling how straight it is, how unnatural in a place this remote. You wonder if you're touching the work of hands that belonged not just to another culture, but to another era entirely, one whose name is gone, whose people are gone, but whose knowledge lingered just long enough to leave this silent proof. And then imagine, for a moment, that those hands weren't human at all, or at least not human as we are now. That's where speculation leaps from the grounded to the extraordinary. Some theorists suggest the possibility of other intelligent species, parallel to or predating us, who might have left these engineering fingerprints. Mainstream archaeology doesn't endorse such views, but the idea persists because Pumapunku and places like it give us a tantalizing taste of something we can't quite explain. Whether you see it as the pinnacle of Tiwanaku skill, the legacy of an older civilization, or simply the result of human determination and cleverness, Pumapunku remains a stone riddle. And like all good riddles, it keeps people coming back, staring at its pieces, trying to fit them into a story that makes sense. If there was someone before us, before the Sumerians, before Göbekli Tepe, they might not have left us cities we could easily recognize. But perhaps they left us this: the knowledge of how to work stone in ways that still defy the limits we imagine for the past. Sometimes the most unsettling thing about history is not what we find, but what we don't. You could line up the great monuments, Stonehenge, the pyramids, Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, and still, between them, there are stretches of time that feel like vast, empty rooms. Centuries, even millennia, in which no major ruins, no written records, no clear cultural fingerprints appear. Archaeologists call this the archaeological silence, but the term feels too gentle. It's more like a long breath held by the earth. It's tempting to think this absence means nothing happened. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Cultures can leave behind a little trace if their materials were perishable, if they lived in regions prone to erosion or volcanic destruction, or if their population was small enough to vanish without a ripple in the geological record. There's a strange and telling example in the ancient Near East. Between the fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE and the rise of the Babylonian Empire centuries later, there's a relative lull in monumental building. This dark age might suggest stagnation, but in reality people were still living, trading, and farming. The quiet is not because life stopped, it's because we have few surviving records or ruins to illuminate it. Historians are still debating whether climate shifts or political fragmentation caused the gap. Now stretch that idea from centuries to tens of thousands of years. Imagine entire cultures rising and falling within those spans, yet leaving nothing behind that survives into our own era. We might never know they existed unless we stumble upon one of the rare conditions that can preserve their traces: a peat bog, a dry cave, a frozen steppe. Here's an odd fact. The oldest known woven cloth fragment found in a cave in Georgia, the country, not the US state, is about 34,000 years old. It survived only because the cave's stable climate protected it from moisture and decay. Think of all the other fabrics that didn't get that luxury. Every tunic, sail, tent, or blanket that returned to dust without ever leaving a hint of its existence. This fragility means the record of humanity, or of any civilization, is full of blind spots. And the deeper we look into prehistory, the bigger those blind spots become. This is where some researchers introduce the unsettling idea of taphonomic bias, the systematic skewing of our view of the past because of the ways environments destroy or preserve evidence. It's not just that some things are missing, it's that we may be forming our picture of the past from the rare and unrepresentative things that happen to survive. There are places on Earth where almost nothing preserves well. Tropical rainforests, for example, teem with life, but the same conditions that make them rich, heat, moisture, active decay, are also perfect for erasing history. Wood rots quickly, bones dissolve, and metals corrode in months. If a civilization thrived in such an environment tens of thousands of years ago, it could vanish without a trace, leaving only the faintest chemical signatures in the soil. Oddly, the reverse is also true. In deserts, preservation can be excellent, but only for what's left exposed. A city buried by shifting sand might survive in pristine condition beneath the dunes, as happened with the lost Egyptian city of Tanis. Yet if no one happens to dig in the right spot, it could remain hidden indefinitely. The silence is even more profound in the ocean. As we discussed earlier, over 80% of the seafloor remains unmapped in detail. Imagine the archaeological record as a vast book, but with 4/5 of its pages glued shut. Anything written there is, for now, unreadable. This lack of evidence leaves room for speculation. If there were civilizations before us, truly before us, they might have left nothing obvious. No standing stones, no vast temples, just faint disturbances in sediment layers, unusual alignments of minerals, or stray artifacts carried far from their original home. But to see these, you have to know what you're looking for, and even then, you might miss them. Historians are still debating whether gaps in the archaeological record represent true absences or simply places we haven't yet looked deeply enough. The problem is that looking takes resources, and most archaeological work focuses on sites already known to be promising. Remote, difficult environments, the deep ocean, dense jungle, Arctic tundra, remain largely unsearched. Sometimes in those quiet stretches we find single anomalies that feel like faint knocks on a locked door. A lone stone tool where no other human traces exist, a burial unlike any in the surrounding cultures, a shard of pottery that doesn't match the style or clay of any known group. These could be accidents of trade or migration, or they could be the last remnants of a culture swallowed by the silence. Here's a curious image to carry. Imagine the earth as a palimpsest, a manuscript written on, scraped clean, and written on again. Under the current text of our cities and roads are traces of older writing, barely visible, fading with each new layer. With the right tools and enough patience, you might read a fragment here or there, but never the whole story. The silence doesn't mean nothing is there. It means what is there is hidden, or too faint for us to hear, and that should make us careful. Confident as we are in our understanding of the past, we might be living in one of those brief moments between revelations, the calm before a discovery that shifts our view entirely. You might stand in a grassy field or on a mountaintop today, unaware that under your feet, beneath centuries of soil and stone, lies the last whisper of another world, one that lived, built, dreamed, and vanished long before we thought history began. The Earth has a way of reminding us that nothing lasts forever. Sometimes it works slowly, through erosion and the quiet shifting of continents. Other times, it wipes the slate, almost instantly. If you've ever seen satellite images of a hurricane's path or the aftermath of a tsunami, you know how quickly the world we build can be unmade. And in the deeper past, those resets were far larger, disasters that could have ended civilizations in a geological blink. One of the most dramatic examples is the Younger Dryas, a sudden and severe cooling period about 12,900 years ago. For reasons still debated, global temperatures plummeted, glaciers advanced again, and large swathes of the northern hemisphere became inhospitable. Some researchers propose a comet or meteor impact as the trigger, pointing to layers of sediment containing unusual amounts of platinum and tiny spherules that could be debris from such an event. Others suggest massive meltwater floods disrupted ocean currents, plunging the climate back into near-glacial conditions. Whatever the cause, the change was swift, within decades, perhaps even years, and catastrophic for any society dependent on stable weather. Historians are still debating whether this climatic whiplash played a role in the disappearance of megafauna like the mammoth and mastodon, as well as in the collapse or displacement of early human cultures. If there had been a more complex civilization at the time, something beyond the hunter-gatherers we recognize, it could have been erased with shocking ease. The survivors might have carried only fragments of memory into the next age, memories that, over millennia, would become myths. Floods are another powerful reset. The end of the last ice age saw sea levels rise more than 100 meters, inundating vast coastal plains. Imagine the cities, fields, and trade routes that could have existed on those plains, now lying in darkness beneath the waves. Off the coast of Britain, the lost land of Doggerland once connected the island to mainland Europe. It was a rich, inhabited landscape before rising seas swallowed it. The same story played out across the globe. Continental shelves that were once fertile ground are now hidden from easy exploration. Volcanoes have also rewritten history in moments. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, though recent in geological terms, caused the year without a summer in 1816. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere, leading to famine, disease, and migration. That was from a single eruption in a modern interconnected world. Now imagine multiple Tambora-scale events within a few decades, in an ancient context where survival margins were far slimmer. The archaeological footprint of such a collapse could be minimal, especially if survivors scattered into small transient groups. Oddly enough, trees record these catastrophes. Narrow growth rings in ancient wood can reveal years of poor sunlight, hinting at volcanic winters or other disruptions. Even bristlecone pines in California, some nearly 5,000 years old, carry the scars of climate events we only dimly understand. These are the same kinds of subtle markers scientists search for in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, where thin layers of ash or changes in trapped gases can signal past upheavals. Then there are the so-called megadroughts, centuries-long periods of arid climate that can bring civilizations to their knees. The collapse of the classic Maya in the 9th century CE coincided with such a drought, as did the fall of the Khmer Empire in Cambodia centuries later. Now extend that scale into prehistory. A megadrought lasting even a few generations could depopulate whole regions, pushing survivors into exile and erasing the infrastructure they left behind. Without maintenance, roads, canals, and cities crumble quickly, reclaimed by forest or desert. Here's an odd fact to consider. After the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986, the exclusion zone saw a remarkable rebound of plant and animal life within just a few decades. Buildings decayed, streets cracked, and nature swallowed the marks of human presence far faster than most people expected. If our civilization vanished tomorrow, the same process would happen on a global scale. Within centuries, only the most durable materials would remain, and even those would be altered by the environment. Some of the more speculative thinkers have suggested that sudden climate events in the distant past could have rebooted human progress multiple times. Perhaps early civilizations reached a certain level of sophistication, metalworking, long-distance trade, monumental architecture, only to be set back to a subsistence level by a single massive disaster. With each reset, some knowledge might survive in memory or myth, while other skills would vanish entirely, waiting to be reinvented millennia later. The unsettling part is that our own civilization has been lucky to have avoided a true global catastrophe in recorded history. But luck is fickle. The geological record makes it clear that abrupt climate shifts and planet-altering events are not rare over the long term. They are part of the Earth's rhythm. Historians are still debating whether the Younger Dryas, the End Ice Age floods, or other ancient upheavals could hide the fingerprints of lost civilizations. The absence of clear proof is not proof of absence. It may simply be the result of how quickly and thoroughly such events can erase what was. If you stand on a rocky headland and watch a storm roll in, you can feel the scale of nature's power. Waves slam the shore, wind tears at trees, and the air carries the smell of rain and salt. Multiply that by 1,000, and you have some idea of what the Earth can do when it decides to start over. Whatever stood in its way, stone walls, golden temples, bustling ports, would be swept into memory and then into silence. Ice is not just frozen water, it is a time capsule. In the layered depths of glaciers and polar ice sheets, year after year of snowfall compresses into a solid archive, each layer trapping microscopic bubbles of ancient air. Scientists drill deep into the ice and bring up cores, sometimes more than 2 miles long, each segment a frozen record of the atmosphere at the time it formed. In these bubbles are whispers from the past, the levels of carbon dioxide and methane, traces of volcanic ash, pollen from long-vanished forests, even chemical signatures from cosmic events. What's remarkable is how clear the story often is. Ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland show the great swings of the ice ages, the warm interludes, the volcanic winters. But now and then, there are anomalies, sudden spikes or dips that don't neatly fit the expected patterns. One of the most intriguing comes from methane levels. Around 300,000 years ago, there's a mysterious rise in methane concentration that some researchers attribute to natural wetland expansion. Others note that the pattern is oddly similar to what you'd expect if something, say, controlled burning of vegetation or large-scale animal husbandry, was happening on a massive scale. Historians are still debating whether such anomalies can ever be confidently linked to intelligent activity, or whether they're simply quirks of climate. A more recent and often cited example is the so-called Anthropocene signal, the chemical fingerprint of our own industrial age. Since the mid-20th century, ice and sediment layers worldwide have recorded unprecedented increases in greenhouse gases, heavy metals, and synthetic compounds. Future scientists, even millions of years from now, would likely be able to detect this spike, which leads to a provocative thought. If there were a civilization before ours, might it have left a similar chemical trace in the deep past? This is where the search for pre-human industry gets subtle. We're not looking for buildings or statues in the ice. That's not how preservation works here. We're looking for chemical oddities, isotopic ratios that don't match natural processes, unusual combinations of elements, or abrupt changes in atmospheric composition. For example, sustained smelting of metal ores would leave distinctive deposits of lead or copper in sediments and ice layers. Deforestation on a large scale could leave a spike in carbon isotopes. Intensive agriculture might be detectable through shifts in nitrogen cycles. Here's an odd fact that puts this into perspective. Lead pollution from ancient Roman plumbing and smelting has been detected in Greenland ice cores despite the vast distance. At its peak, Roman industry emitted enough lead into the atmosphere to leave a faint but measurable layer on the other side of the world. If that's what we can find after 2,000 years, could we, with enough precision, detect the industrial heartbeat of a civilization tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, of years gone? The challenge is separating the possible from the probable. Nature is a master chemist. Volcanic eruptions, massive wildfires, even the burps of methane from thawing permafrost can mimic the signals we might associate with human-like industry. Without direct artifacts to pair with the chemical evidence, we're left in the realm of interpretation. And interpretation is where the mind tends to wander. Still, the ice sometimes delivers surprises. In 2013, researchers found traces of lead pollution in Arctic ice, dating back to the Phoenician era, suggesting widespread Mediterranean mining had atmospheric reach. In another study, black carbon particles from ancient fires, natural and possibly human set, were found in Antarctic cores, carried there by winds from far-off continents. These findings prove two things. First, that human activity can leave detectable traces across the globe, and second, that those traces can endure for millennia in the right conditions. If there had been an industrial civilization before us, perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, it might not have looked like ours. It might not have burned fossil fuels in the same way. It might have drawn power from sources we can't easily detect, geothermal, tidal, something stranger. But if it mined, smelted, or altered its environment on a large scale, the ice could hold its ghostly fingerprints. Historians and scientists are still debating whether it's even possible to prove such a hypothesis. The deeper you drill, the more compressed and blurred the layers become. Beyond about 800,000 years in Antarctic cores, the resolution drops, and events start to merge in the record. A short-lived industrial age, say, a few hundred years, could easily be smeared into invisibility by the weight of ice above it. There's also the strange fact that our own global signature will likely outlast almost every physical thing we've built. The Eiffel Tower will rust away, the Great Wall of China will crumble, but the spike of synthetic chemicals and greenhouse gases in ice and sediment will persist, a permanent marker of our moment. It's humbling to think that a future civilization could know we were here without ever finding a single intact building. So imagine yourself standing on the endless white of Antarctica, drilling down through layer after layer of frozen history. Each core you bring up is a cylinder of time, striped like a barcode. Somewhere deep down in the compressed ice of ages before ours, you might find a stripe that doesn't belong, a sudden change in chemistry that whispers, "Something happened here." And just as you lean in to read it, the wind howls across the ice, and you're reminded that this is still the Earth's domain, and its deepest secrets are not given up easily. Beneath our feet lies a history written not in words or symbols, but in layers, strata of sediment, stone, and fossil. Every layer is a page in the Earth's immense book, though most of its chapters have never been read. The deeper you go, the older the story becomes, and the harder it is to turn the pages without tearing them apart. If you wanted to hide the remains of a civilization so completely that no one could ever find them, burying them deep within these layers, or letting time do the burying for you, would be a foolproof plan. The geologic process of burial is relentless. Over centuries and millennia, wind and water carry dust and soil into valleys and basins. Floods lay down silt, landslides deposit tons of debris, and volcanic ash blankets everything in reach. The weight of these deposits compresses them into stone, sealing whatever lies beneath into the fossil record. But not all rock is equal when it comes to preservation. Sandstone might preserve a footprint or a tool, limestone might keep delicate fossils intact, but igneous rock, formed from molten lava, obliterates anything in its path. If a city or industrial site were buried beneath layers of sediment, eventually those layers could turn to stone. The artifacts inside, if they survived, would be encased, perhaps unrecognizable. Imagine an alloy wheel or a steel beam crushed under kilometers of rock. The metal might corrode entirely, leaving behind only a faint chemical fingerprint, a concentration of elements unusual for the surrounding geology. Without knowing to look for it, a geologist might dismiss it as a natural anomaly. Historians are still debating how likely it is for complex artifacts to survive such deep time burial. Fossils, after all, require very specific conditions to form: rapid burial, minimal oxygen, and mineral-rich water to replace organic material. Artifacts made of stone have a better chance, but even they can be fractured, dissolved, or transformed beyond recognition over tens of thousands of years. Here's an odd fact. The oldest known paved road is in Egypt, near the quarries at Wadi al-Jarf, and dates back about 4,600 years. That's almost nothing in geological terms. Now imagine a road 10 times older, buried beneath layers deposited by floods and windstorms, then overrun by forests, then scraped clean by glaciers. What would be left? Perhaps a faint discoloration in the soil, or a slight difference in texture. Something you might notice only if you happen to dig in exactly the right place. In the deep rock record, there are also strange, isolated anomalies that raise eyebrows. Layers with unusually high concentrations of certain metals, fossilized plant material with chemical changes suggesting intense burning on a scale far beyond natural wildfires. Some of these anomalies line up with known events, volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, but others are harder to explain. Could any of them be the industrial byproducts of a civilization so old that its bones have turned to dust? The question is uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit how much we don't know about our own planet's past. One of the best places to look for such traces might be ancient riverbeds. Rivers are both builders and destroyers, carrying material far from its source and laying it down, elsewhere. A fragment of pottery or metal could end up hundreds of kilometers from where it was made, deposited in layers that later harden into rock. Millions of years from now, if someone split open that rock, they might find the fragment embedded there, a puzzle piece without a picture. Oddly enough, we already have examples of fossilized technology from our own time, objects preserved in unusual ways by rapid burial, cars swallowed by landslides, ships encased in silt at the bottom of harbours, even the remains of modern cities entombed in volcanic ash, as at Pompeii. In each case, the preservation is almost accidental, dependent on a perfect combination of circumstances. Without such luck, the artifacts would decay and disappear. If a pre-human civilization existed hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago, most of its remains would be gone by now. Geological forces would recycle its metals, crush its buildings, and scatter its ceramics. But some traces might survive: thin layers rich in certain isotopes, deposits of unusual minerals, or sediment layers with patterns that defy purely natural explanation. These traces wouldn't look like the ruins we imagine. They'd look like blips in the geological record, visible only to those who know how to read them. Historians and geologists are still debating whether such blips in the deep past, like sudden changes in sediment composition or unexplained mineral deposits, are worth investigating as potential signs of ancient industry. The problem is, the Earth is noisy. It produces anomalies on its own, without any help from us or anyone before us. Without context, it's hard to tell a signature from an accident. Picture yourself in a canyon, surrounded by towering walls of layered stone. Each band is a memory of an ancient sea, a desert, a floodplain. Somewhere in those layers might be a thin seam, a darker stripe, rich in something unusual. You run your hand across it, feeling the grit, the weight of millions of years pressing down. Is it just a quirk of mineral deposition? Or is it the last surviving breath of a world that lived and died before ours? The canyon won't answer. The rocks keep their secrets. The deeper we dig, the more we realize that the Earth is not just a stage for civilizations, it is also the curtain, capable of closing over the play so completely that no one even remembers it happened. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery. Not what we find, but how much has been hidden, layered away in stone, waiting for someone curious enough and lucky enough to turn the right page. If the deep layers of rock and sediment are the Earth's closed book, then radioisotopes are like the faint ink marks that sometimes bleed through the page. These tiny variations in atomic makeup, ratios of isotopes that occur naturally or through specific reactions, can tell stories that stone alone cannot. Scientists use them to track volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, and even the burning of fossil fuels. But there's a thought that lingers at the edge of the mind. Could they also reveal the fingerprints of a civilization that lived long before ours? One of the first places to look is for unnatural isotope ratios. On our own planet today, nuclear reactors and weapons tests have released distinctive signatures into the environment, spikes in isotopes like cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239. These elements do not occur in significant quantities naturally. They are products of deliberate nuclear reactions. In the far future, even after the structures and machines are gone, traces of these isotopes could linger in soils, sediments, and possibly even in the rock record. Now reverse the question. If there were a technological civilization before us, could it have left behind isotopic anomalies we've already detected but misattributed? Historians and geologists are still debating whether any unusual patterns in the deep record might qualify. Some odd concentrations of uranium and its decay products have been found in ancient strata, but most are explained as the result of natural ore deposits. Yet there's a famous exception, the Oklo natural nuclear reactors in Gabon, Africa. Around 2 billion years ago, a combination of conditions allowed uranium ore bodies at Oklo to sustain natural fission reactions, essentially acting as self-sustaining nuclear reactors for hundreds of thousands of years. The isotopic signatures from this event are striking, and they prove something important. The Earth itself can produce patterns that mimic the byproducts of advanced technology, which means that even if we found similar anomalies elsewhere, we'd have to tread carefully before claiming they were artificial. Beyond nuclear signatures, there are other chemical traces that might be worth watching. Industrial processes often concentrate elements in ways nature does not. Massive deposits of fly ash from burning coal, unusual ratios of stable carbon isotopes from large-scale fossil fuel use, or concentrations of rare metals like tantalum, niobium, and tungsten, which are typically mined for specialized technologies. If a civilization before us engaged in similar extraction and processing, their activity could have left behind mineralogical hotspots that persist long after their machines and buildings have vanished. Here's an odd fact to frame the idea. Lead pollution from ancient Roman smelting has been found in Greenland ice cores. The Romans didn't know it, but they were creating a chemical postcard to the future, one that would be readable thousands of years later. If we can detect traces of a 2,000-year-old industry half a world away, it's conceivable that we could find older and subtler markers if we knew where to look. Some researchers have proposed scanning the geological record for stratigraphic techno-signatures, a term borrowed from the search for extraterrestrial life. These are essentially layers in the rock or sediment that carry the distinct stamp of technology. Unusual isotopic ratios, synthetic compounds, or element combinations that have no known natural origin. One day, if our science becomes sensitive enough, we might be able to detect such techno-signatures buried deep in Earth's own past. But here's the catch. Without corroborating artifacts, these signals are ambiguous. A spike in carbon-13 depletion could indicate the large-scale burning of fossil fuels, or it could be the result of a massive natural peat fire. An unusual mineral deposit could be the remains of an industrial smelter, or the byproduct of a volcanic eruption. Without a clear chain of evidence, every anomaly is a conversation between possibility and probability. Oddly enough, a similar problem exists in astronomy. When radio astronomers detect strange signals from space, they have to ask, is this an alien transmission, or just a pulsar, a quasar, or some other natural phenomenon? The first pulsar detected in 1967 was jokingly labelled LGM1 for little green men before its true nature was understood. On Earth, in geology, the same cautious skepticism applies. This doesn't mean the search is hopeless. It means the search is subtle. We may never find a buried skyscraper or a fossilized computer, but we might find a layer of rock that tells us something extraordinary happened, something that doesn't quite fit the rhythms of volcanoes, impacts, or glaciations. It could be a whisper from a deep-time neighbour, recorded not in their language, but in the quiet dialect of isotopes. Imagine walking in a canyon, splitting a rock, and finding within it a seam of fine-grained material flecked with tiny glittering particles. You take a sample, analyse it, and the ratios are wrong, just wrong enough to make you wonder. Not wrong enough to prove anything, but enough to keep you awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering who might have stood on this same ground hundreds of millennia before you, working metal, splitting atoms, and leaving behind only this faint signal for you to find. Historians are still debating whether we should actively search for such signals in Earth's deep past. It's an expensive, time-consuming effort, with no guarantee of reward. But perhaps the greatest reason to look is the simplest. The Earth has been around for billions of years, and we have occupied it for only a heartbeat. It would be arrogance to assume no one else ever left their mark here. When we talk about the possibility of civilizations before ours, we almost always picture humans, or at least something very much like us, building cities, crafting tools, and leaving behind monuments in stone. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if intelligence itself has worn more than one face on Earth, and what if one of those faces vanished so completely we barely know it was there? The fossil record is full of surprises about who was here before us. Whales, for example, are descendants of small, hoofed land mammals that returned to the sea about 50 million years ago. Birds are the living branch of the dinosaur family tree, their bones tracing a lineage that survived the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. And then there are the hominins, our close relatives, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, who thrived for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing, leaving only fragments of bone and DNA inside us. But what if the story goes deeper than that? Evolution doesn't have a rule that says intelligence must appear only once. In theory, it could emerge multiple times, in different forms, separated by millions of years. An intelligent species might not look anything like us. It could have been smaller, adapted to dense forests or coastal wetlands, its tools made from materials that decayed quickly. It might have left no towering monuments, just the equivalent of villages and technology that the Earth's climate erased long ago. There's a strange and often overlooked example in the form of the cephalopods, octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid. They're masters of problem-solving, camouflage, and even tool use, despite being evolutionarily as distant from us as a clam. They have complex nervous systems, the ability to learn, and even individual personalities. If environmental pressures had favoured it, could a cephalopod lineage have developed technology? In the distant past, when oceans and climates were different, perhaps there was room for a path we can't easily imagine, one where intelligence bloomed underwater, never leaving stone ruins for us to find. Here's an odd fact. The earliest known octopus fossil is about 95 million years old, and it looks remarkably similar to modern species, which means they've had tens of millions of years to refine their survival strategies. Intelligence is not a new invention. It's a trait that has cropped up again and again in birds, mammals, and marine life. The question is whether it ever reached the threshold of civilization before us. Historians and paleoanthropologists are still debating the boundaries of what counts as civilization in the first place. Is it agriculture, writing, monumental architecture, long-distance trade? By those definitions, many human societies across history would not qualify, yet they still shaped their environments, developed complex cultures, and passed down knowledge. If a non-human species reached a comparable level tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, their traces might be so subtle we'd overlook them, especially if they were ocean-based, nomadic, or relied on organic materials. There's another possibility that edges toward the unsettling. Perhaps another hominin species, not Homo sapiens, once reached an advanced stage of tool use and culture, but collapsed before leaving an obvious signature in the archaeological record. We know Neanderthals crafted tools, used fire, made pigments, and buried their dead. Denisovans left behind jewellery and stone tools in Siberian caves. These cousins of ours overlapped with us for thousands of years. What if one of them, or a different, now extinct branch, had a golden age we've never uncovered? The challenge is that evolutionary time is vast and most species' histories vanish without a trace. Fossils are rare, especially for small populations or those in erosive environments. The absence of bones or tools doesn't prove absence of intelligence. It only proves the limits of our current evidence. Oddly, some of the most compelling hints of deep time intelligence come from behaviours that leave no physical mark. Migratory birds navigate across continents with precision. Dolphins coordinate hunts and pass knowledge across generations. Chimpanzees teach their young how to use sticks to fish for termites. None of these behaviours fossilise. If similar intelligence existed in the deep past, without the leap to durable technology, we might never know it. Imagine for a moment a coastal species 200,000 years ago. They craft nets from plant fibres, boats from hollowed logs, fish hooks from bone. They trade shells, tell stories, and navigate by the stars. Their numbers are small, their settlements seasonal. Then a rapid sea level rise floods their home range. Within a few generations, their artifacts decay, their population dwindles, and their memory becomes nothing more than campfire stories told by the survivors. Stories that fade before anyone learns to carve them into stone. Historians are still debating how far back we can plausibly push the existence of complex intelligence on Earth. We tend to assume it's a rare, almost miraculous trait, yet the history of life is full of traits that have evolved independently many times. Eyes, wings, echolocation. Why not civilization? Why not more than once? If that's true, the intelligence before ours might not have been human at all. And that makes the search for it even harder, because we wouldn't necessarily recognise its traces. We'd be looking for ourselves in the mirror, when perhaps the mirror should be a window, showing us something entirely different. So, picture yourself in a museum 1,000 years from now, looking at a single small artefact in a glass case. A curved shell, polished smooth, drilled with tiny holes. The plaque says it was found in a sediment layer 300,000 years old. The experts call it a natural curiosity, shaped by currents and sand. But what if instead it was the pendant of someone whose name we'll never know, a person from a civilization we've completely forgotten, because we never thought to look for them in the first place? If there is a single place on Earth where the ghosts of lost civilizations could rest untouched, it's the ocean floor. The sea is both destroyer and guardian, relentlessly corrosive in some places, yet perfectly protective in others. Beneath the waves, especially in the cold, dark depths, there are ruins that could lie undisturbed for tens of thousands of years, beyond the reach of storms, scavengers, and human curiosity. The trouble is, we have barely looked. Over 80% of the seafloor remains unmapped in high resolution. That's not just the deep abyssal plains miles down, but also the more accessible continental shelves, the very places that would have been dry land during the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower. If there were ancient settlements, ports, or even cities along those coasts, they would now be underwater, perhaps hundreds of kilometers from the present shoreline. Some of what we've already found hints at this possibility. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans have revealed what appear to be geometric structures, rectangles and lines, buried beneath thick layers of silt. Divers have brought up artifacts that, if the dating is correct, would make the site far older than any known city. Critics point out that without controlled excavation, it's difficult to confirm these findings. Historians are still debating whether the shapes are the work of humans or simply the natural patterns of the seabed. Then there's the Yonaguni monument in Japan, with its massive terraces and sharp-edged platforms descending into the blue. Some divers swear they see carved steps and pathways, even stylized animals. Others insist it's nothing more than the natural fracturing of sandstone. The truth is, the ocean has an uncanny way of blurring the line between the organic and the engineered, between what nature makes and what we think only we can make. Oddly enough, the sea can sometimes preserve things far better than land can. In the frigid waters of the Baltic, wooden shipwrecks centuries old sit on the seabed with their masts still upright, the carvings on their hulls intact. In the oxygen-starved depths of the Black Sea, ships from the Byzantine era, and possibly even earlier, are preserved so well they look almost ready to sail again. If that can happen to a ship, it could happen to a building, a monument, or even a whole settlement given the right conditions. One curious fact: much of the world's best-preserved archaeology lies in places people rarely visit. The cold, the darkness, and the pressure of the deep act as natural guards. Below about 200 meters, sunlight fades entirely. Below 1,000 meters, the temperature hovers near freezing. Here, life moves slowly, and the processes that rot wood or corrode metal on the surface are slowed to a crawl. If a city slid beneath the waves and settled in such a place, it might be waiting there still, silent and intact. Imagine walking through a harbour town just before the seas rise. Boats pulled up on shore, warehouses stacked with goods, market stalls brimming with food and tools. Then the waters come, slowly at first, then faster. Streets flood, buildings collapse, people flee. Over the years, the sea takes it all, covering the ruins with layers of silt, coral and shell. Thousands of years later, sonar pings might trace faint outlines in the darkness, the ghost grid of a city no one remembers. Historians are still debating whether to prioritize underwater archaeology in the search for deep prehistory. The technology exists, autonomous submersibles, high-resolution mapping, but the cost is high and most funding still goes to sites on land. And yet, the odds are compelling. If civilization arose along coasts, as it often does, it would make sense that the oldest, most original cities are now drowned. Some speculate that even if we never find a grand Atlantis, we might find smaller, scattered settlements, each a clue in a larger puzzle. They wouldn't need to be huge to be important. A single worked stone in the right place, a street pattern under the sand, could shift our understanding of human history, or reveal that it wasn't only humans shaping it. Here's an odd aside. Deep-sea corals can live for thousands of years, their skeletons recording the chemistry of the ocean during their lifetimes. Studying them is like reading tree rings from another world. If a massive disturbance, pollution, temperature change or sediment runoff had occurred long ago, corals might carry that record. In a way, they could be witnesses to a vanished coastal civilization, speaking in a code we've only just begun to decipher. The ocean hides its dead well. Even modern shipwrecks disappear into its folds if left long enough. A pre-human city, buried in sediment, could lie utterly unknown beneath your feet as you float above, unaware. The surface might show only a rolling expanse of water, nothing to hint at the streets, walls, and lives once below. It's strange to think that the truest museum of our planet's past might not be in deserts or mountains, but under miles of shifting salt water. and stranger still to think that what lies there could be older than the pyramids, older than agriculture, perhaps even older than us. Maps are stories made visible. They are as much about memory as they are about geography, snapshots of how people understood their world at a given moment. Most are drawn for practical reasons, to find your way home, to reach a trading partner, to mark resources. But some maps are stranger, holding details that seem to belong to a different time entirely. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral of the same name, is one of the most famous of these oddities. It shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and what appears to be a portion of Antarctica, 3 centuries before anyone is known to have seen the continent, and even more strangely, apparently without its ice. The map itself contains notes saying it was compiled from older sources, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. Historians are still debating whether the Antarctic-looking section truly represents the frozen continent or is simply a distorted depiction of South America. But the idea lingers. Could some ancient mariners have charted lands that no longer exist in their present form? Another curiosity is the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which also depicts what appears to be Antarctica, complete with mountain ranges and rivers. Again, the official discovery of the continent wouldn't come until the 19th century, and certainly not with knowledge of its hidden topography. Skeptics argue these details could be coincidences or artistic embellishments, but those who see something deeper wonder if such maps are echoes, copied and recopied over centuries, of charts made by a civilization capable of surveying on a global scale. Oddly enough, the oldest confirmed nautical charts from human history are far younger than these anomalies. The earliest known Portolan charts, made by Mediterranean sailors in the 13th century, already show impressive accuracy for their time but don't depict distant continents, which makes the accuracy of certain pre-modern maps even harder to explain if they truly came from local knowledge alone. Here's a strange but true aside. Polynesian navigators could cross thousands of miles of open ocean without maps, using only the stars, the motion of the waves, and the flight patterns of birds. They memorized star paths and ocean swells as if they were living maps. This shows that advanced mapping in a cultural sense doesn't always mean pen and parchment. It can be a body of oral knowledge handed down for generations. If such a tradition were ever lost, its only remnants might be vague coastal outlines or mythic descriptions preserved in art and story. Historians are still debating how to classify certain other ancient cartographic anomalies. The Cantino planisphere of 1502, for instance, shows parts of the New World before they were officially explored by Europeans. Some attribute this to early unrecorded voyages. Others suggest older source maps, possibly from cultures whose maritime achievements are now forgotten. The possibility that such charts might have origins reaching back to a much earlier age is tantalizing, but difficult to prove. Maps also have a way of preserving memories of lost lands, places now underwater or reshaped beyond recognition. Plato's story of Atlantis is the most famous, but it is hardly unique. Medieval European maps sometimes included mythical islands like High Brazil, supposedly visible only once every 7 years off the coast of Ireland. Whether these were navigational errors, mirages, or legends rooted in real but now vanished islands, they remind us that coastlines are not fixed. A map drawn thousands of years ago could depict a shoreline that no longer exists. One odd fact that connects maps to deep history. Sea level rise since the end of the last ice age has swallowed more than 20 million square kilometres of land. That's an area larger than South America, much of it along coasts where people would have lived. If a civilization mapped those coastlines before they drowned, their charts would look alien to us now. In theory, fragments of those maps could have been copied into later works, with their original context lost. Imagine holding such a fragment in your hands, perhaps just a scrap of parchment showing a bay and a chain of islands. You might not recognize the place at all, because it no longer exists. But if you overlaid it on a map of ancient coastlines reconstructed by geologists, you might find it fits perfectly in a world drowned 10,000 years ago. The idea that ancient maps could be based on knowledge from a forgotten civilization remains speculative, but it's not impossible. We know that map-making traditions can last for centuries, even millennia, in oral or written form, and if you accept that knowledge can be handed down across generations, it's not hard to imagine it being handed down across ages, from one rise of civilization to the next. So perhaps some of the oddities in the historical record are not errors or fantasies at all, but memories, faint and fading, of a world that looked very different from the one we know. A world whose shorelines have shifted, whose cities are now reefs, whose rivers flow in different beds. And maybe, just maybe, some cartographer long ago copied those ancient lines onto fresh parchment, never knowing they were sketching the ghost of a lost world. When we think of fossils, we imagine the bones of long-dead creatures turned to stone, their shapes preserved but their living essence gone. But what if technology, our tools, our machines, could fossilize too? Not in the sense of delicate gears encased in amber, but as transformed, mineralized remnants hidden in the rock, unrecognizable at first glance. If a civilization existed long before ours, some of its artifacts might survive in just this way, mistaken for natural formations until someone looked more closely. The process is straightforward in theory. Just as organic matter can be replaced molecule by molecule with minerals, preserving a bone or shell, so too could certain technological materials undergo the same transformation. A ceramic shard could be encased in stone, a metallic object could corrode and be replaced by mineral deposits, leaving behind a perfect but mineralized shape. If buried under the right conditions, low oxygen, stable temperature, such objects could last millions of years. The challenge is recognizing them. In a quarry or an eroded hillside, a fossilized gear might look like nothing more than a patterned rock. Without knowing its artificial origin, even a trained geologist might pass it by. Historians and archaeologists are still debating whether some unusual stone formations found in mines and outcrops are natural concretions or something more deliberate. One famous curiosity is the so-called Coso artifact, discovered in 1961 by rockhounds in California. It appeared to be a metal cylinder encased in a geode-like concretion. Initial excitement led to speculation about ancient technology. Later examination suggested it was likely a modern spark plug surrounded by a concretion of iron oxide, a reminder of how easily our imaginations can outrun the facts. But the case also shows how nature can disguise even recent artifacts as something ancient and mysterious. Oddly enough, the oldest known example of fossilized technology we can confirm is humble pottery. Fragments of clay vessels dating back tens of thousands of years have been found fused into sedimentary deposits, their shapes warped but still recognizable. Pottery survives because it is already partially mineral, baked into durability. If a pre-human civilization ever mastered ceramics or fired brick, traces might still exist deep underground, waiting for erosion or excavation to bring them to light. Another durable category is glass. Natural glass, like obsidian, lasts for millions of years, and human-made glass, though prone to weathering, can persist for astonishing lengths of time if buried in stable conditions. Imagine stumbling on a chunk of mineralized glass in a layer of rock dated to hundreds of thousands of years ago. Without clear context, it might be catalogued as a volcanic byproduct, even if it was once the window of a building or the lens of an optical device. Metals pose a different problem. Most corrode rapidly in open environments, but certain alloys, if buried deep and sealed off from air and water, can survive. Archaeologists have found bronze tools thousands of years old in near-perfect condition. Iron is more fragile, but stainless steel could, under the right circumstances, endure for hundreds of millennia. The question is whether we would even recognize it after so long. Mineralization might transform it into something resembling ore or stone, its original shape barely hinted at in its contours. Here's an odd fact to frame the scale of survival. The oldest known stone tools made by early hominins in Kenya are about 3.3 million years old. Simple, chipped stones, but unmistakably shaped by hand. If something as modest as a flaked rock can last that long, so could other artifacts, provided they're made of resilient materials. Which makes you wonder, if there were any such things older than that, have we already walked past them without noticing? Historians are still debating how likely it is for a pre-human civilization's artifacts to survive intact enough for recognition. Some argue that without context, a site with multiple objects, clear stratigraphy, and other supporting evidence, an isolated find might never be accepted as artificial. Others believe that with improved scanning and analysis technologies, we might one day detect subtle manufacturing patterns in materials thought to be natural. Imagine standing in a dusty archaeological lab. On the table in front of you is a stone, matrix split in two. Inside is something odd, a smooth, symmetrical cavity lined with a mineral crust. At first glance, it looks like a fossil shell, but its edges are too precise, its symmetry too exact. You scan it with a 3D microscope and see machining marks, faint but undeniable. Suddenly the room feels colder. You're not just looking at a rock, you're looking at the last surviving trace of hands and minds that worked the earth long before we ever did. It's a poetic thought, and a sobering one, because if such fossilized technology exists, it might not be in museums or treasure vaults. It might be sitting in boxes of unremarkable rocks in university basements, or buried under the soil in a place no one has reason to dig. We may already have held the past in our hands and set it down, never realizing what it was. And perhaps one day, a future civilization will do the same with what we leave behind, turning over a chunk of mineralized plastic or corroded alloy, wondering who we were and why we vanished. Archaeology is often thought of as the science of what we find. Broken pots, stone walls, rusted tools, but just as much can be learned from what we don't find. Sometimes the silence is louder than the evidence. Historians call these negative spaces in the record, and in them, entire civilizations might be hiding. The gaps are like the missing pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, shapes we can sense, even if we can't yet see the picture. The most obvious gaps are temporal. Whole stretches of prehistory seem curiously empty of material culture. A population appears in the archaeological record with a certain level of technology, then disappears, only to be replaced, sometimes thousands of years later, by a new culture with skills that don't seem to connect naturally to what came before. In some cases, this could be migration or natural cultural evolution. In others, the jump feels abrupt, like a page torn out of history. Historians are still debating whether such leaps are evidence of lost intermediary cultures or simply a quirk of preservation. One example comes from the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, around 50,000 years ago, when symbolic art, complex tools, and long-distance trade suddenly appear in multiple places. Was this a sudden spark of innovation among Homo sapiens, or the result of knowledge passed down, perhaps fragmentary, from an earlier source? The record before this is sparse enough to keep the question alive. Another form of absence is geographical. Some regions of the world are rich in archaeology, others, equally habitable, seem barren. This can be due to environmental factors. Jungles and wetlands destroy artifacts quickly, but it can also be due to exploration bias. The deep interiors of certain continents, dense equatorial forests, and much of the seafloor remain largely unexamined. If a civilization thrived in one of these areas tens of thousands of years ago, its absence from the record might say more about where we've looked than about whether it was there. Oddly enough, there's a precedent for rediscovering entire cultures hidden in plain sight. For centuries, the ancient city of Great Zimbabwe was dismissed by European colonists as too sophisticated to have been built by the local people. It took careful archaeology in the 20th century to prove otherwise. The ruins had always been there, but their story had been erased by prejudice and assumption. Now scale that erasure up to prehistory, and you begin to see how an entire civilization could vanish into the margins simply because no one thinks to look for it. Here's an odd fact to frame the problem. Roughly 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. If the same ratio applied to civilizations, then almost all the societies that have ever risen would be gone without a trace. That's a sobering thought for any historian, because it means the sample we work from could be a tiny, unrepresentative sliver of what really happened. Sometimes the absence is technological. You find evidence of agriculture, but no sign of the transition from hunting and gathering. Or you find advanced stonework without any trace of the tools used to make it. These missing links in development may simply be lost due to decay, or they may suggest that a group inherited skills from somewhere else, perhaps even from a culture already in decline. Without written records, we're left with a chain that has more missing links than present ones. Historians are still debating whether such gaps are meaningful. Skeptics argue that archaeology is inherently incomplete, and that there's no need to invoke lost civilizations when simpler explanations suffice. But the more optimistic view is that these absences are invitations, blank spaces on the map of time that ask to be filled in. Sometimes, absence is caused by erasure. Conquerors destroy the records of the conquered. Religions suppress the monuments of older faiths. Fires, floods, and earthquakes can erase centuries in a single day. Imagine an ancient city consumed by a volcanic eruption, its ruins buried deep, its memory surviving only in scattered oral traditions. Without excavation, that absence would remain permanent, and there's the deeper erasure of time itself. Given enough millennia, even the greatest works of human hands vanish. Forests swallow them, deserts grind them down, seas take them. If a civilization before ours fell tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, the odds are high that nothing recognizable would remain on the surface. The gaps in our timeline might be all that's left, the negative impression of a vanished world. Picture walking through a museum where entire display cases are empty. Each one has a label, period unknown, and a small note explaining that the artifacts, if they existed, are gone. Yet the space between the cases feels as telling as the ones that are full. You can almost imagine what might have been there, even without seeing it. That's the archaeology of absence, listening for the stories the earth refuses to tell directly. And in that silence, we might find the faint echo of something extraordinary. A civilization we can't see, but whose shape we can still trace in the voids it left behind. If you step back far enough, history starts to look less like a straight road and more like a wheel. Civilizations rise, flourish, decline, and vanish, only to be followed by others who in their turn believe themselves to be unprecedented. This idea, that human history might be cyclical rather than linear, has appeared in myths, philosophies, and even some modern historical theories. And if the pattern is real, it opens the door to a sobering thought. Maybe we aren't the first to stand at the top of the wheel. Many ancient cultures believed in such cycles. The Hindu concept of yugas describes vast ages of time, each with its own rise and fall of morality and civilization, repeating endlessly. In Mesoamerican cosmology, the Aztecs believed the world had already been created and destroyed several times before their own era. The Greeks spoke of successive ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, heroic and iron, each worse than the one before. These aren't just poetic metaphors, they're structured stories about worlds before the present one, each ending in catastrophe. Historians are still debating whether these myths are purely symbolic or if they preserve hazy memories of real collapses and rebirths. In recorded history, we can see smaller cycles at work. The Roman Empire expanded, reached its peak and fell, leaving behind a fractured Europe. The Chinese dynastic cycle, rise, consolidation, decline, collapse, played out repeatedly over thousands of years. Even on shorter timescales, societies experience golden ages followed by dark ages, periods of growth and innovation followed by stagnation and loss. Now stretch those patterns into the deep past. Imagine a civilization reaching heights we can only guess at, then collapsing due to disaster, climatic, geological, or self-inflicted. The survivors scatter, knowledge is lost, and in time their descendants rebuild, perhaps with fragments of inherited skills they don't fully understand. To them, their achievements are new. To the Earth, it's just the wheel turning again. One odd fact to consider: the city of Troy, immortalized in Homer's epics, was rebuilt at least 9 times on the same site. Each time it rose, each time it fell, and each new city was built upon the ruins of the old. Archaeologists excavating Troy can literally walk down through layers of civilization stacked on top of each other, each with its own pottery, weapons, and walls. It's a miniature version of what could happen on a planetary scale. If this cyclical view is right, then the real question isn't whether there was a civilization before ours, it's how many there might have been, and whether any of them reached a level of complexity equal to or beyond our own before the wheel turned and erased their works. The difficulty, as always, is evidence. The deeper into time we go, the harder it becomes to tell one cycle from another. Geological processes blur the layers, remove the debris and mix the artifacts, if any survived at all. Oddly, there's a resonance here with ecology. Forests regrow after fires, coral reefs recover after bleaching events, grasslands return after floods. The living world doesn't care if the new growth is truly new or just a regrowth from old roots. Civilizations might work the same way, sprouting again from the seeds of the past, even if they don't know the soil was once cultivated. Historians are still debating whether there are signs in our own history of inherited knowledge, concepts or techniques that appear suddenly, without a clear developmental path. The invention of agriculture, the sudden emergence of monumental architecture, the mastery of metallurgy, all could be framed as rediscoveries rather than inventions, depending on how you interpret the gaps. Imagine this pattern playing out for hundreds of thousands of years. Each time the wheel turns, the record of the last rise is mostly erased. A few myths survive, stripped of their original detail, A few artifacts endure, buried deep or altered beyond recognition. The rest is gone, folded back into the earth. And then the next stage begins, certain that it is the first to climb the hill. Here's a sobering thought. If our own civilization were to vanish tomorrow, the traces we've left might not last more than a few 100,000 years in a recognizable form. Future societies, whether human or something else, might build their own wheel without ever knowing we were here. And maybe that's how it has always been. The wheel turns, the stages change, the actors leave the stage and new ones step forward, unaware that they're repeating a story that has been told many times before. If stone and sediment are the Earth's memory, then DNA is our own. Inside every cell of your body lies a record written in chemical code, passed from one generation to the next, copied billions of times over millions of years. Most of it is instructions for building a human, but some of it, strange fragments, duplicated sequences, dormant stretches, acts like footnotes from earlier chapters of life, notes left by ancestors we can't fully identify. If there was contact long ago between our lineage and another intelligent species, this is where we might still find its shadow. We already know our genetic story is not as tidy as school textbooks once claimed. Modern humans share DNA with Neanderthals and Denisovans, cousins who lived alongside us until as recently as 40,000 years ago. These overlaps are the result of interbreeding, moments when separate branches of the human family tree lean together. In some people, especially in parts of Oceania, Denisovan DNA accounts for up to 5% of the genome. Historians and geneticists are still debating what these inherited fragments mean. Some sequences appear to be linked to immune system strength or adaptation to high altitudes, such as in the Sherpa people of the Himalayas. But there are also sequences in our genome that don't seem to have a clear origin at all, genetic material that doesn't match any known ancient population. Could some of these be traces from a hominin species we haven't yet discovered? Here's an odd fact. In 2019, scientists sequenced DNA from a teenage girl's bone fragment found in a Siberian cave. She was a hybrid. Her mother a Neanderthal, her father a Denisovan. It was the first direct evidence of such a first-generation cross, something that until then had only been guessed from genetic data. That fragment, a mere sliver of bone, carried the memory of two entire vanished species meeting in one life. The deeper we look, the more tangled the tree becomes. Ancient DNA studies have revealed ghost populations, entire groups that must have existed in order to explain certain genetic patterns, yet have left no fossils we can identify. They live on only in the code, like faint handwriting under newer text. Some researchers speculate that if intelligent species existed before our own lineage, even tens or hundreds of thousands of years earlier, they too could have left microscopic echoes in our DNA. It's a controversial idea, because DNA decays over time, and the farther back you go, the harder it is to detect. Even under ideal conditions, the oldest intact DNA we've recovered is about 2 million years old, from Greenland permafrost, containing genetic traces of plants and animals, but no humans. Still, some stretches of our genome are far older, preserved not as whole sequences but as deeply conserved instructions, genetic phrases repeated for eons. If an intelligent species interbred with our distant ancestors, perhaps only a few small fragments remain, buried in the billions of letters that make up our code. Oddly enough, this possibility isn't limited to hominins. Some scientists have studied the idea of horizontal gene transfer, the movement of genetic material between species by means other than reproduction. Viruses, for example, can insert their genetic code into a host's DNA. Over evolutionary time, these viral insertions can become permanent. Around 8% of the human genome consists of ancient viral DNA. Most of it is harmless junk, but some of it is active, even essential. One viral gene helps form the placenta. It's unsettling to think that parts of what makes us human came from encounters with something not human at all. Historians and evolutionary biologists are still debating whether such genetic borrowings could ever come from an advanced intelligent source. If they did, the evidence might not be a recognizable signature, but rather a handful of unusual sequences with no clear natural history. Sequences we might overlook entirely because they blend into the chorus of ancient DNA we all carry. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit genetics lab late at night. You're scrolling through data on a glowing monitor, eyes blurring over endless strings of A, T, C, and G. Then you notice a sequence that doesn't match anything in the database. It's not bacterial, not viral, not from any known primate. It's something else. You can't tell if it's a fluke, an error, or the first hint of a lineage that lived and thought and dreamed long before us. The sample is small, the signal faint, but you can't shake the feeling that you're not alone in your own DNA. If such a discovery were ever confirmed, it would change how we see ourselves. We'd stop thinking of humanity as a solitary peak and start seeing it as part of a much older and broader landscape of intelligence, most of which has vanished into time. The body you live in might carry in microscopic traces the handshake of another mind from an age before memory. And perhaps, in a way, that means we are already the descendants of a civilization before ours. We carry them inside us without even knowing their names. Picture the Earth not as a stage for one long unbroken play, but as a theatre where the curtain has fallen many times. Each act begins with a fresh cast, a new script, a new set of ambitions. The audience, if there is one, never sees the actors from the last performance. All that remains are faint impressions on the stage floor, props left behind in the wings, and rumours passed down by those who swear they've been here before. If there were civilizations before ours, human or not, their stories are scattered across every part of this planet we've explored so far, and in the far greater expanse we haven't. They might be whispers in the ice, anomalies in isotope ratios, impossible stones cut with forgotten methods, fragments of DNA that don't fit the family tree. Or they might be nothing at all that we can recognise, just voids in the record where something once stood. Historians are still debating how far back civilization, by any definition, can truly go. The oldest agreed upon city sites are only about 10,000 years old. Our own industrial era has lasted scarcely 2 centuries. Measured against the 4.5 billion years of Earth's history, this is less than the flicker of a candle. The odds that nothing else of note has happened in that vast darkness seem slim. Here's an odd fact to put it in perspective. If you compressed all of Earth's history into a single calendar year, modern humans would appear sometime in the last 37 minutes of December 31st. The entirety of recorded history would take place in the last few seconds before midnight. And that's just us. Imagine how many stories could fit into the previous months of that year. Stories erased, overwritten, or buried beyond reach. Some scientists have suggested that if we vanished today, future civilizations, even millions of years from now, could still detect our presence through a thin layer in the geological record, a spike in greenhouse gases, synthetic chemicals, and radioactive isotopes. That would be our techno-signature. But what if we are already living atop someone else's? What if the thin lines and odd anomalies we see in ice, sediment, and rock are the signatures of civilizations that lived, thrived, and fell before the first stone of Göbekli Tepe was raised? The trouble is, we expect the past to look like us. We search for skyscrapers, for written words, for machines made of steel. But an older civilization might have been different in every way. Different priorities, materials, even senses. Their traces might be here, but invisible to our eyes because we don't know what we're looking for. Imagine walking along a windswept plain, miles from any city. You pick up a smooth, heavy stone, turning it over in your palm. It feels oddly balanced, comfortable to hold. Perhaps it's just a rock, or perhaps it's the last surviving fragment of a world long gone, the only piece small enough and strong enough to endure the turning of the wheel. If the cycles are real, if civilizations rise and fall and rise again, then we are simply the latest passengers. The knowledge we think of as eternal may be as fragile as smoke. The monuments we believe will last forever may not even see the end of the next cycle, and the moment we think we've reached the top of the mountain may just be the moment before the slope turns downward. And yet, there's comfort in the idea too, because if others came before us and vanished, then perhaps it is in the nature of intelligence to keep trying, to rebuild, to reimagine, to send its voice forward into the future even when it knows the Earth will one day erase it. We may be walking on the bones of forgotten cities, breathing the air they once breathed, drinking the water that once ran through their rivers. In that sense, the past is not gone at all. It's under our feet, in our lungs, and maybe even in our blood. So the wheel turns, the curtain falls, the theatre goes dark for a while, and then, somewhere, the lights rise again. You can let your eyes grow heavy now. The wheel has turned, the curtain has fallen, and whatever stories came before us are resting quietly where they belong, some in stone, some in water, some in the faint chemistry of the air. We have walked together through deserts and over mountains, beneath the ice and down into the deep ocean, following trails that were more suggestion than certainty. And yet, those trails have a way of lingering in the mind, don't they? Even if we never find proof, the wandering itself becomes a kind of proof, of curiosity, of the desire to connect across ages, of the quiet hope that we are part of something larger and older than we can see. The world outside your window has its own deep history. The ground beneath you is not just dirt or concrete, it is a palimpsest of countless lives, cycles, and forgotten springs. Long before you were here, the wind blew across these same hills, rain fell on these same stones, the stars above have watched every turning of the wheel, every rise and fall, they will watch again and again. It's all right to let the questions go unanswered for now. You don't need to solve the puzzle tonight. You can leave it on the table, pieces half assembled, and trust that time will keep them safe until you're ready to look again. So take a breath, slow and gentle. Let it out. Let the weight of all those ages press softly against you, not as a burden, but as a blanket. You're here in your moment, and that is enough. The past will wait. The future will wait. For now, the story closes, and the night carries you onward. Good night.